All right, here we go. Story 14 is Sammy. As promised, this one is a bit of a mystery. So it looks like we're at school again. We have the alphabet in the background. Here's Mrs. Jules. And then we've got, these look like arms with mittens hanging off of them and water. What appears to be a little head, and then a thick layer of coats. So I'm wondering then if this water could be sweat, or maybe the coats are wet. Maybe it's raining outside and this person needed to stay extra warm. So let's find out about Sammy. It was a horrible, stinky, rainy day. Some rainy days are fun and exciting, but not this one. This one stunk. All the children were wet and wore smelly raincoats. The whole room smelled awful. "Oh, it stinks in here," said Mauricia. Everybody laughed, but she was right. There was one good thing, however. There was a new boy in class. New kids are always fun. Except no one could even tell what the new boy looked like. He was completely covered by his raincoat. "Class, I'd like you all to meet Sammy. Let us show him what a nice class we can be." Leslie walked up and smiled at Sammy, but her smile quickly turned into a frown. "You smell terrible," she said. "Leslie!" exclaimed Mrs. Jules. "That's no way to greet a new member of our class." Mrs. Jules wrote, yep, you got it, Leslie's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. "But he does, Mrs. Jules. He smells awful," said Leslie. "You're ugly," Sammy replied. "Now, Sammy, that's no way to talk," said Mrs. Jules. "Leslie is a very pretty girl." "She's ugly," said Sammy. Allison spoke up. "Well, you smell terrible and are probably even uglier. But nobody can see you because you're hiding under that smelly old raincoat." "That will be enough of that," said Mrs. Jules. "Now, Sammy, why don't you take off your coat and hang it in the closet? Let us all see how nice you look." "I don't want to, you old windbag," said Sammy. "That's because he's so ugly," said Leslie. "I'm sure he's quite handsome," said Mrs. Jules. "He's just shy. Here, let me help you." Mrs. Jules took off Sammy's raincoat for him, but underneath was still another raincoat, even dirtier and smellier than the first one, and they still couldn't see his face. "Oh, now he smells even worse," said Mauricia. "You don't exactly smell like a rose either," Sammy replied. Mrs. Jules took off his second raincoat, but there was still another one under that, and the smell became so bad that Mrs. Jules had to run and stick her head out the window to get some fresh air. "You're all a bunch of pigs," Sammy screeched. "Dirty, rotten pigs!" The smell was overpowering. Sammy just stood there, hidden under his raincoats. Mrs. Jules wrote Sammy's name under the word discipline. "Send him home on the kindergarten bus," said Joy. "Not with me," said Todd. Mrs. Jules held her nose, walked up to Sammy, and removed his raincoat. She threw it out the window. But he had on still another one. Sammy hissed, "Hey, old windbag, watch where you throw my good clothes." Mrs. Jules put a check next to Sammy's name on the blackboard. Then she took off another raincoat and threw it out the window. The smell got worse, for he had on still another raincoat. Sammy began to laugh. His horrible laugh was even worse than his horrible voice. When Sammy first came into the room, he was 4 feet tall, but Mrs. Jules removed 6 of his raincoats. He was only 3 feet tall, and there were still more raincoats to go. Mrs. Jules circled his name and removed another coat. She threw it out the window. Then she put a triangle around the circle and threw another one of his coats outside. She kept doing this until Sammy was only 1.5 feet tall. With every coat she took off, Sammy's laugh got louder and the smell got worse. Some of the children held their ears. Others could hold only one ear because they were holding their nose with the other hand. It was hard to say which was worse, the laugh or the smell. Sammy stopped laughing and said, "Hey, old windbag, If you take off one more of my coats and throw it out the window, I'll bite your head off. They smell too bad for me to allow them in my classroom, said Mrs. Jules. You can pick them up when you leave. They smell better than you do, pighead, Sammy shouted. Mrs. Jules didn't stop. She took off another one of his coats, then another and another. Sammy was only 4 inches tall, 3 inches tall, 2 inches tall. At last, she removed the final coat. And all that was there. What do you think's there? Moment of suspense. All that was there was a dead rat. Well, I don't allow dead rats in my classroom, said Mrs. Jules. She picked it up by the tail, put it in a plastic bag, and threw it away. Mrs. Jules didn't allow dead rats in her class. Todd once brought in a dead rat for show and tell, and Mrs. Jules made him throw that one away, too. I'm glad Sammy isn't in our classroom, said Rondi. I didn't like him very much. Yes, said Mrs. Jules. We caught another one. Dead rats were always trying to sneak into Mrs. Jules' class. That was the 3rd one she'd caught since September. Dun, dun, dun. So it kind of makes you wonder if there's a little bit of a conspiracy going on. How are the dead rats alive enough to speak and come into the classroom that they are causing such a problem? It kind of makes you wonder who's behind it and if we'll find out ever the mysteriousness behind the dead rats sneaking into the classroom. So, tune in next time for some more.